from St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.
The 2023 Missouri legislative session is officially underway. This session brings not only new lawmakers and new bills to pass, but also new leadership. On this episode of Politically Speaking, new House Floor Leader Jon Patterson joins the show. The Lee's Summit Republican speaks on what he feels his caucus can accomplish this year. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
My promise to St. Louis was that I would do the absolute most for each and every person, starting with those who have the very least.
What I wanted to do was look and see what other states are doing.
We have to be willing to change those laws, that they are balanced and they affect everybody equally.
As somebody that grew up in the St. Louis area, North St. Louis County, I didn't know any lawyers growing up.
We got to find long-term solutions to make government better, but also to be able to provide services to people.
I don't want to leave that federal money that we've been leaving all these years on the table.
We need to be spending this money to take care of Missourians.
I thought we accomplished a lot this year, but a lot more needs to be done.
Welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, State House and Politics reporter Sarah Kellogg. Joining me in St. Louis is my co-host, St. Louis Public Radio's political correspondent,
Jason Rosenbaum.
And our guest today, joining me in the Jefferson City office, he is the Republican representative for the 30th District in the Missouri House and the new House Floor Leader,
State Representative Jon Patterson.
Thank you for joining us on the show, Representative, our first guest of 2023. Before you get started, I would love if you talked about, for our listeners, your district, where it is, and who you represent.
Okay, well, thanks, Sarah and Jason. Really glad to be with you. I'm from Lee's Summit, and the new district is all Lee's Summit, and so it includes the north part of Lee's Summit and the eastern part of Lee's Summit. And Lee's Summit has grown so much recently, we now have 3 state representatives that cover the area.
And, give us a little bit of background about yourself and why you decided to run for office.
Well, I've lived in Jackson County for most of my life. I grew up in Blue Springs, went to public high school there, and then I went off to Mizzou, where I went to college and medical school there. I met my wife there, and then we moved back to Jackson County, and I did my surgical residency down at University Health. And then I went I joined a private practice surgery group out in eastern Jackson County, and I did that for 11 years.
And why did you decide to make that jump over and run for office?
Well, it was always something that had interested me, politics and policy, just growing up and in college. And I knew I wanted to be a surgeon, so I went and did that. And there came a point where my state rep seat came open and, just discussed with my family about, do we think we can do this? Do we think that I have anything different to offer than somebody else? And ultimately, we decided that it was something that we could do. My family supported it. My financial planner did not. But we ran, we were able to win, and here we are.
Yeah, I want to touch on that. Did you have to stop doing surgery in order to do this job?
No, I did it part-time, and there have been some other physicians that have done it, but it's a very hard thing to do. And as of this year, I no longer do the surgery part, just with this new position, and I really want to focus my time and energy on that.
Yeah, speaking of that new position, running for office is one thing, and another is running for leadership. Why did you decide to run for House Floor Leader?
Well, just like when you're thinking about running for office, you have to ask yourself, do you think you can add something to the conversation? Do you think you can add something to the House Republican Conference? And I, after thinking about it, I really did feel like I could lead the caucus, and you basically spend about a summer or a year running for the position, just meeting with the different members, meeting with them in their districts, going over your vision and their vision for the House conference, and ultimately I was able to gain the support of my colleagues, and it's a huge honor to have, and very humbling, and just kind of getting into the position now.
We're talking the day after the first day of session. And so kind of what are your thoughts now, one day down? I guess 2 technically. We had a technical session today. But, what are your thoughts going into session? How do you think it's going to run?
Well, I'm very optimistic about the session. I thought yesterday when we got sworn in, I thought it was great. I thought our Speaker Plocker did a great job, gave a great speech, and laid out our House Republican vision for the session. I think this session has the potential to be very productive, and I say that with cautious optimism. The leadership in the House and with the Democrats and the Republicans, I think we will find ways to work together and find areas that we can work together on. And then I think the Senate leadership, I've gotten to know them in the past month or so, and I'm very optimistic about working with them, and I think it could really be a great session.
You mentioned cooperation between Democrats. Is there any specific issue that you have in mind where the two parties could tangibly work together?
I do. I think, I'll give you an example of one. There is legislation that would provide postpartum or health care after the baby is delivered to the mom. We know that you can't have a healthy baby if you don't have a healthy mother. If the mother is sick or depressed or on drugs, that baby doesn't have a chance for its own health. So I think that is a bill that has broad support within both the Democrat and Republican parties, and I think that is something that we'll be able to work on together.
House Minority Leader Crystal Quaid said her and her caucus have a good working relationship with both you and Speaker Dean Plocher. What are your thoughts about the working relationship, and could you see that there could be some issues where that good working relationship suddenly turns into a not so good working relationship?
Yeah, I think in politics, the relationships can sour pretty fast if you let them. I think the thing that we have going for us is it's not something that's just come about recently. The speaker's been around for 6 years now, or 7 years. He's been building these relationships. I've been here 4 years now, and I've really tried to focus on just trying to understand where they're coming from and trying to get them to understand where we're coming from, not taking anything too personally and not making things personal. So I know they have their beliefs. I know they have their jobs to do, and we respect that. And I think if you come from a position of respect, you can overcome most of the problems that you'll come across.
Last year, at the end of session, then Speaker Rob Vescovo, he said he did not believe that the Senate respected the House as a body. Coming new year, new leadership, how have relationships been so far with the Senate, communication, that kind of thing?
The relationships have been great, and I've got a lot of respect for Speaker Vescovo. I don't have much history with the Senate, and I would never presume to speak for the Senate and their traditions and the way they go about doing things. I have a great deal of respect for them over there and the jobs that they have to do. Also, it's kind of fortunate that 5 of the new senators are good friends that came over from the House, so I think that will be a factor. But I have a lot of respect for them over there, and we're just going to kind of work with them and try to find common ground and get things done instead of dealing with personalities or personal fights.
Personal fights and personalities was probably one of the reasons why 2022 was not as productive as Republicans would like. And when we were at that press conference yesterday, I asked Speaker Plocher if acrimony that defined the last couple of years was a thing of the past. Here's a clip from that press conference.
I feel confident that the 163 members that serve in the House will work together. We're not going to have that infighting. I can only control and help control, really, let's be honest, it's herding cats, but I can only work within the sandbox that I'm in. And the other half of the building has its ways and its rules on how it functions. I'll leave that up to them. They have good leadership over there. I'm confident they're going to work well together this year. I'm just really optimistic.
And what's kind of implicit in my question, and I think what was said by Speaker Plocher, is there probably was some House-Senate friction, but the most friction was actually within the Senate Republican caucus, and that really caused a lot of legislative havoc for Republicans. So how, again, you can't control the Senate, but how optimistic are you that that's not going to happen in 2023?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. Like I said, I don't know the Senate as well as I do the House, and I would never presume to speak for any of them over there. The only thing I can do is just look forward. And sometimes in politics, I think the best thing is to have a short memory. The fights of the past are not our fights. The people that are over there, some of them have left. So I'm going into it with a clean slate for everybody and a short memory.
So Speaker Plocker outlined some priorities in his speech, and I'd love to ask you about them. So one of those is an additional tax cut. Do you think there will be an appetite for a tax cut since lawmakers just reduced taxes over a special session?
I think there's always an appetite within the Missouri House Republican Conference anyway that we can always find a way to lower the tax burden on working families. Our tax revenues are still very robust. We have $5 billion in the general revenue fund. Some of that money we ought to look at getting some of that money back to the citizens. Now, whether that's a tax cut from income, whether it's personal property tax, I think we as House Republicans always want to look at how can we reduce the tax burden on the taxpayers.
And we'll get to some of those specific ideas in a minute. But one of the people who was not enthused about the prospect of more tax cuts is House Minority Leader Crystal Quade. Here is her speaking at a press conference yesterday.
Absolutely not. Listen, we have a $6 billion surplus. And as I've said many times, we have probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make real investments in Missouri and Missourians. Of course, a tax cut sounds great. It's a one-time thing. What we need to be doing as a legislature is looking at what investments can we make for the long haul. When Missouri isn't in the same financial situation that we're in, we're still going to need to be paying for things. And so what can we be doing right now, looking beyond our own elected offices into the future?
How do you continue to cut taxes without digging a hole 2-3 years from now when the financial situation of the state is not as good?
Well, I think you have to do that very carefully, of course. You have to weigh the benefits and the harms that come with cutting taxes. But like she stated, we have a huge surplus right now. And you wouldn't have to give all of that back in the form of tax cuts. But I do think if you're talking about an appetite, we do have an appetite for always seeing if we can reduce the tax burden on taxpayers, being mindful that things are not always going to be as rosy as they are and that revenues are not always going to be as robust. And some of the things that we've done in the past, like triggers, I think are worth looking at. But it doesn't just have to be in the form of income tax cuts. I think personal property is a huge issue, at least where I'm from in Jackson County, and I know it is for some of your listeners. I think we can look at reforming that. But in terms of looking at tax cuts, I think it's something that's a priority for the Speaker and our House Republican caucus.
I want to talk about that aforementioned surplus for a minute. And this is kind of a wonky question, but I think it's an important one. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to just put $5 billion in an account and not do anything with it. Has there been any thoughts about maybe creating special accounts and then creating like one-time grant programs for localities to fight crime or to aid certain education initiatives, or just do something with that money on like one-time bases?
Well, I haven't seen any hard plans, but I think you'll see that in the budget that comes out in the next few weeks. I do agree with you that the money shouldn't just sit around. We do have to be mindful that revenues aren't always going to be this good, and some of that should be reserved for those days. But like you said, one of the things that we could do is make one-time grants to police departments or municipalities where they could hire or increase the pay of law enforcement officers. I think that would be a great thing to do and make an investment in those communities.
You know, some Democrats have suggested cutting taxes for things like groceries or for feminine hygiene products. You know, would that be something that you think both parties could get behind?
I think so, and I think we've had such bills in the past, and they generally have broad support within both Republican and Democrat parties. Other things you can do is we've looked at, teacher pay is a huge issue, and we've looked at cutting income taxes for teachers so that we can retain and recruit some of those teachers. So all of those things are on the table, and again, they all reduce the tax burden for working families.
We're going to get to education in a second, but you mentioned personal property tax. What do you think the prospect is of phasing out or eliminating the personal property tax, which I know some people in Jefferson City is a major priority?
Well, personal property tax reform is something that we would very much like to see. It's a huge issue, especially for people in Jackson County and I think maybe St. Charles County as well. But we want to be mindful that you don't rob Peter to pay Paul, take away the personal property tax, and then put the burden on the real estate owners. So I think phasing it out is an idea. I'll give you one other idea that I think that we looked at last year but weren't able to get done. But, the value of your car has gone way up in the pandemic. A used car is worth maybe more than it was when it was new. One of the things that we would like to have seen is that given the assessors the ability to look back within 3 years to give the assessment of the car instead of using this false valuation so that people aren't paying as much as they were when the values skyrocketed.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be right back. And we're back on Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio's State House and Politics reporter, Sarah Kellogg. Joining me is my co-host, Jason Rosenbaum, political correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio. And our guest today is Republican Representative Jon Patterson, who represents the 30th House District, which includes parts of Jackson County. Let's get back into it. You mentioned education, so we have some questions about that. That's also something that Speaker Blocker talked about, and we're going to also talk about personal property tax again. With education, if the personal property tax is phased out, wouldn't that cut off a major funding stream for public schools?
It might do that, and that's why I said that we have to do it in a way that it doesn't place too high of a burden on those localities so that they can fund their public schools. That's why I think a phase-out is necessary, but with real estate increasing in value, I think you could do that over time.
Do you think that schools are going to likely see like a temporary windfall from the personal property tax hikes, and they may be able to use that money locally for capital improvement projects or maybe a one-time pay increase for teachers without having the state get involved, basically?
I think undoubtedly you will. With the high valuations of personal property, I think there will be a bit of a windfall, and that they should use those for capital improvements or raising teacher pay.
So we've seen a number of school districts shift to a 4-day school week, like most notably the Independent School District in your neck of the woods. What do you think about school districts doing that?
Well, you're right, Jason. And part of that district is one that I used to represent, so it's an issue that hit very close to home. I don't think that having kids go to school 4 days a week is good for the kid or good for the parents. We have historically low unemployment right now. The problem is not the jobs, it's getting people into the jobs. And how do you work as a parent when now you have an extra day that you don't have childcare? So I think it plays into the workforce, it plays into the development of the child. I have not talked to anybody in my district or constituents that are in favor of this 4-day school week. And I think the reason that they give is that it's hard to recruit and retain teachers, and this is a benefit. I think we need to do other things to get the best teachers out there, and I think a lot of that has to do with teacher pay.
Yeah, you kind of hit on one of my other points, that if you're in a 2-parent household and both parents work, like I don't know how a 4-day school week works unless the child is physically in that building on the 5th day. And even though I think that there are some schools that are offering that, I mean, others may not have the staffing to actually accomplish that, especially if they're giving the teachers, an extra day. But I guess conversely, the argument I've heard for a 4-day public school week is teachers like that having only 4 days, and it gives them more time to plan. So what do you think of that argumentation?
I can see that. I can see where working 4 days and having a time to plan would be a benefit. That's why I think it has to be, well, we want you to work 5 days, but we're willing to compensate you for what you deserve. And we want teachers to be paid more. I don't think nobody that I know thinks teachers are paid enough to do the work that they do. I can't imagine doing the work that they do, taking care of 20 third graders. So they deserve to be paid more. I think we have to say, we need you to work 5 days. It's best for the child and it's best for the community, but we're willing to compensate you for what you deserve when you do that.
What does raising teacher pay look like to you? Is it through kind of a grant program? Is it raising the floor of the minimum of teacher pay? I'm curious, what that looks like.
Well, there was recently a Blue Ribbon Commission, and some of the lawmakers from the General Assembly served on it that were school teachers and superintendents. So I really respect what they put out. They put out essentially 9 points, and 6 of those had to do with teacher pay. And those were that you have to have a minimum. that you pay teachers in the state, and it has to be far higher than the $25,000 that's the state minimum right now. I think that's the first thing we could do. We did that last year with essentially a one-time grant. I think realistically we will need to keep that going because you can't take it away after it's been there. And I think we've reached this sort of point where everybody agrees we have to do something, or it will be a crisis. I know we use that word a lot, but if we can't find teachers, there's going to be more 4-day school weeks, and it's going to wreak havoc.
You know, I talked to Senate Minority Leader John Rizzo about teacher pay. I mean, his district is Independence. He talks about how, his own kids would have to face a 4-day school week. And we talked about teacher retainment. And part of it, he said part of it's pay, but another part is teacher morale and making sure teachers are feeling valued. And when bills pass, such as maybe limiting what teachers can teach or allowing parents to have more involvement or even possibly sue schools, that creates kind of an environment where it feels like teachers versus parents, children. Kind of how do you address that as well? I mean, pay is one thing, but also making sure they feel valued.
That's an interesting point. I think, we want our teachers to be there and teach the kids. I can see where they might think, some of the laws that we have are trying to impose burdens on them. That could not be further from the truth. What we're really trying to do is protect the kids and make sure that kids and parents are deciding what's being taught in schools. Like I said, I have the utmost respect for teachers and the job they have to do, but we do have to be mindful that kids and parents ought to be able to control what they get in their schools.
Okay, so I think another issue that a lot of Republicans have talked about over the last year or two is going after critical race theory in school, but I really think that that's an avatar for diversity curriculum writ large. I don't think it's just critical race theory because there's not a lot of evidence that critical race theory is being taught in public schools. From my understanding is that specific class is a law school level class. So, but I think that every year you hear bills about wanting to get rid of CRT in schools. So with that kind of backdrop, what's the Republicans' posture toward this issue?
I think you're right. I'm not sure that CRT is being taught widely throughout the school, although it's not something that I'd be in favor of teaching young kids, and I'll talk about that in a second. I think there is good legislation out there that empowers students and parents, but it is not punitive to teachers. I think Senator Koenig has Senate Bill 4, which is sort of an education bill that almost passed last year. I think it should have passed last year. It just ran out of time. But I think it's billed as a parent's Bill of Rights, and it has in there that parents have the right to see what's being taught to their kids. Parents have a right to know if their kid is receiving medical treatment at schools. It says that you can't teach that one group of people is inherently better than another or are inherently racist because of who they are. But it also has protections for teachers and says you can teach history. You can teach that we have a great history as a country, but we have not always lived up to our ideals, and you can talk about that. I think it's a good middle ground bill, and it kind of does what we want it to do. With respect to CRT, I agree with you. I think nobody has a great definition for it, but it seems to be this sort of catch-all analytic framework that really should be discussed at a postgraduate level. And I'm not sure that my third grader who's trying to learn what 8 times 8 is needs to be exposed to CRT at this point. I think we need to learn about our history, but to teach kids that one group is inherently better than another or is inherently racist that's the wrong thing to do.
So let's just say a school district has curriculum that runs afoul of that definition, which frankly is pretty subjective. Like, what would the state do to that school district?
I think within the bill you would report them to DESE. And then if they continue to do that, they could lose school funding if they continue to break the rules.
An area that seems to have bipartisan support is the topic of child care. What policies would you like to see regarding child care? Is it policy? Is it funding? I'm curious kind of what that looks like to you.
I think this is the thing that people aren't talking about as much pre-session that I think is going to be a big thing at the end of session, because childcare is so important. Like I said earlier, we're having trouble finding people to work, and the burden a lot of times falls on women, and so they can't be in the workforce. We want people to be able to work, but childcare is a huge issue. There are specific bills that I think help address that. There's a bill by Senator Arthur and Representative Brenda Shields that would increase the number of 3 to 5 year olds that can attend preschool, which is good for the student and is childcare. I don't know anything more than you do, but I do think that we're going to be hearing about something with regard to doing something for businesses that will incentivize them to, whether it's on-site childcare or giving their employees a benefit to go out and get childcare, that it would incentivize those businesses in some way. So I would like to see something, whether it's a tax credit for the businesses or using grants or whatever it is, to get businesses to assist with childcare.
Yeah, so you would be kind of more on board for an incentivizing rather than kind of like a mandate, carrot versus stick.
Absolutely, yeah. Provide incentives, but it's so important to getting people in the workforce that I think it's going to be a big thing this session.
I want to move on to a different topic. One of the other major aspects of Speaker Plocker's speech was decrying violent crime that's affected Missouri's cities. What would Republicans want to do to specifically deal with this issue?
Well, I've seen a number of proposals out there, and again, these are bills that have been filed that are the starting point for a discussion. I think Representative Lane Roberts has a good bill out there that's sort of a omnibus crime bill, and it has in there, of course, allowing the governor to declare a state where the Attorney General could come in and prosecute violent crimes. It has things in there where people being released from incarceration would get birth certificates and IDs so they can go out and get jobs. It kind of tightens up the laws on unlawful possession of a firearm. So I think we'd like to start there, but crime is a huge issue, and getting the people to move to Missouri and get businesses here. They're not going to do that if they don't feel safe.
Obviously, you're a Kansas City area lawmaker, but there's been some noise from some Republicans about wanting to yank quote unquote local control away from the city of St. Louis Police Department. And I'm just going to be I want to make sure our listeners understand what that means. St. Louis, like Kansas City, used to have a board that was primarily appointed by the governor, run the police department. There was a ballot initiative in the 2010s that essentially gave the mayor's office in St. Louis control over the police department. So with that wordy explanation out of the way, what does your caucus think about moving to a Kansas City style governance for St. Louis?
I'm not sure the caucus has a position yet, but I know I've spoken with a number of the St. Louis representatives and some law enforcement representatives from St. Louis, and it seems like they are very much in favor of it. I've looked at it, and I think there's good things and bad things about doing it. Like I said, I'm from Kansas City, and we have state control. So I think it's going to be one of the bigger things that we discuss this session. Like I said, there's upsides and downsides to it. I think in the past it was given back to St. Louis because the state felt that we didn't want it. So now I think that experiment's been done, and we're going to take it or try to take control of it back. So I think that's a discussion that we're going to have, but I'm not sure the entire caucus has a position on it, but I feel like the St. Louis representatives are generally in favor of it.
St. Louis just brought in a new police chief from Wilmington, Delaware. Shouldn't the state give him a chance to see how he can fight crime before we radically change how his department is governed?
I think that's one of the arguments that people will make, and I think it's a valid argument. But I think what we would say is that crime has gotten to be such an issue in St. Louis that we might need to take action sooner rather than later.
One thing that Democrats in particular have been pretty vocal in supporting is instituting what is known as red flag laws. And again, I want to define what a red flag law is. It's generally the idea that if somebody is a danger to themselves or others, there could be a judicial proceeding to take away weapons from that person. I've gotten the sense Republicans are not super wild about this idea. Like, what is kind of your caucus's posture towards this proposal?
Well, a peculiar thing happened in the last 2 years in that gun deaths have become the number one killer of children in this country, surpassing car accidents and disease. So we are very mindful that gun violence is an issue. And some of these laws that are being looked at, we will give them the attention that they deserve, these emergency risk protection orders. What I can tell you is that you have to weigh that. We have to weigh those bills against the citizens' right to have property and defend themselves. And I think you're right that the House Republicans would be very, very leery about doing anything that infringes upon the Second Amendment rights of our citizens.
I want to talk about IP reform, which is something that we have talked about before, but I think that that's also a pretty priority this year. Republicans seem to be rallying around the idea that it should be harder to amend Missouri's constitution. What specific plan do you think will get traction?
Well, that's a good question. There are a number of different proposals out there. What I would tell your listeners is that what we feel like is that the Constitution of the state ought to be the foundation for our governance and our democracy, just like the U.S. Constitution is. And the U.S. Constitution has a very high barrier to changing it, which is good. If you take a look at our constitutional initiative petition process, it takes 50% plus one of people voting on that day. And we think that if you're changing the Constitution, it should be something that's higher, that reflects consensus and compromise. And you don't have that with just a simple majority. It's also important to note that we are not trying to change citizens' ability to veto legislation that we pass through a veto referendum or to pass laws through the initiative process, just to change the Constitution.
Wouldn't a better idea be if Republicans don't like a specific ballot initiative to run better campaigns against them? The campaigns against a minimum wage increase and Medicaid expansion, for instance, were not great. The anti-recreational marijuana campaign was also underfunded.
Yeah, and that proves, I think that demonstrates the point that the initiatives that do pass and that are offered they have an advantage when they have moneyed interests behind them. And I think you've seen that recently. That special interests can come in, they have the money to fund these campaigns and get the changes to the Constitution that they want.
Why do you think that because this proposal will have to go to voters, why do you think that this proposal will fare better than one in Arkansas, which failed pretty miserably?
Yeah, it did. I think it failed 60-40. But I'll tell you, on the Arkansas IP reform, I don't think I myself would have voted for it because it did change the statutory provisions as well. So it was included in that. And we would not have that. Like we said, if citizens want to pass laws, we would still leave you the ability to do that. We're talking just the Constitution here.
Is there more urgency to put something on the ballot on this topic? Because there's been a lot of rumblings about how foes of Missouri's abortion ban are going to try to put something on the 2024 ballot, and that raising the threshold for a constitutional amendment, if this proposal is a constitutional amendment, could make that repeal and replace of the abortion ban harder to pass.
I really don't think so. This is something that we've been discussing all the years I've been in the legislature. We've passed it out of the House. It's something that's been a priority for us every year. I think just with the makeup of the different houses now, I think it has the best chance of passing, and that's why you're hearing more about it. But this is something that it doesn't have a huge lobbyist lobbying for it. In fact, they're probably against it. It's just something that we think is the right thing to do. And I also think that if Democrats were smart and had foresight, they would want this as well, because as unthinkable as it is that we would have a Democrat-led Missouri someday, that could happen, and that will happen someday. And just think of all the things that Republicans could pass through the IP process if that were to happen.
Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Missourians reject changes to the constitutional threshold in August of 2024, and that there's a constitutional amendment to legalize abortion in November 2024. Like, how do you think that abortion initiative would fare among voters? Because when we were asking Crystal Quaid about it, like they're coming up with an idea of what is actually in this proposal, and it seems like it's going to dominate discussions over the next few months and couple of years if it comes to pass.
I don't know how it would fare. I think it would depend on what exactly is in the initiative petition. If it's something very extreme, I think there's a good chance that it doesn't pass. So, but you never know at this point because the campaigns haven't come out and made their cases. But I think there is a chance that it could not pass if it's too extreme for the state.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Representative Patterson, for joining us on the show. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is a part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. You can follow all of our work at stlpr.org. And Representative Patterson, where can people find you on the internet where you want to be found?
I think they could find me on Facebook. I don't do Twitter or anything like that.
Good man.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Until next time, so long.